Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. On the behalf of the African School of Regulation, I would like to warmly welcome you to today's webinar on building credible and investment-ready regulatory frameworks in Africa's energy sector. We are delighted to have participants join us from across Africa and beyond, representing governments, regulatory authorities, utilities, development partners, academia, and the private sector. We are privileged to be joined today by a distinguished panel of leaders who will deliver our opening remarks. Their perspectives will help frame today's discussion and highlight the importance of this topic. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Madame Debier Roth, the Executive Director of the African Forum for Utility Regulators, for her opening remark. Madame Debier, please, the floor is over to you for your opening remark.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mega. Good afternoon, everyone, distinguished guests, colleagues, partners, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the African Forum for Utility Regulators, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar on building credible and investment-ready regulatory frameworks in Africa's energy sector. Allow me at the outset to express our sincere appreciation to our partners, the African School of Regulation and the Islamic Development Bank, for collaborating with AFU in convening this timely and important discussion. Your commitment to strengthening regulatory capacity and advancing sustainable energy development across Africa is deeply valued. Africa stands at a defining moment in its energy journey. While the continent is richly endowed with energy resources and renewable energy potential, it continues to lag behind the rest of the world in electrification, particularly in rural and peri-urban communities. Millions of Africans still lack access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable electricity, and far too many households continue to rely on traditional cooking fuels. Addressing these challenges requires substantial investment. However, investment does not flow on the basis of resource potential alone. It follows confidence, predictability, and credibility. This is why strong, transparent, and independent regulatory frameworks are fundamental to Africa's energy future. Credible regulation creates the certainty that investors seek. It supports cost-reflective tariffs while protecting vulnerable consumers. It promotes financial sustainability for utilities, encourages innovation, facilitates private sector participation, and provides a stable environment needed for long-term infrastructure investment. We are all well aware of the challenges confronting the sector. These include limited financing, inadequate policy and legislative frameworks, weak governance and regulatory independence, insufficient infrastructure, limited technical and human capacity, unpredictable regulatory regimes, and tariff-setting processes that are often influenced by competing political interests rather than economic realities. These challenges continue to increase investment risks and slow progress towards universal energy access. No single institution can overcome these obstacles alone. Strong collaboration between governments, regulators, utilities, the private sector, development finance institutions, researchers, and development partners is essential if we are to build resilient, investment-ready energy sectors that support inclusive economic growth and sustainable development across the continent. Today's webinar provides an important platform to exchange experiences, share best practices from across Africa and beyond, and explore practical approaches to strengthening regulatory governance, improving institutional coordination, reducing investment risks, and creating enabling environments for both public and private investment. I encourage all participants to engage actively, share your perspectives and challenges, and challenges, and challenge us to think differently. The quality of our discussions today can help shape stronger regulatory institutions that deliver better outcomes for investors, utilities, and most importantly, the people of Africa. With these remarks, I thank you once again for joining us and for your continued commitment to Africa's energy future. I wish you all fruitful, productive, and engagement deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Debier, for your opening remark. Our second speaker is Mr. Idrissa Diaye. He is the Director of the Economic and Social Infrastructure Global Practices Department at the Islamic Development Bank. Mr. Idrissa Diaye, you are welcome. The floor is yours for your opening remark.
Muted, please.
Mr. Diaye, Idrissa Diaye, can you hear us?
Yeah, he's muted. Mr. Idrissa, please, you are muted. Kindly unmute for us.
Okay.
Okay.
Is it good now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much again for the introduction, and we thank Mrs. Debbie for setting the scene. I was about to say that she had said it all and could relieve me from providing additional remarks. But frankly, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to gather you all today in this webinar, a platform of knowledge sharing, a platform of exchange, a platform from convergence around good practices, good global practices that can serve the member countries we work for. Esteemed panelists, dear colleagues from the African School of Regulation and African Forum from Utility Regulators, dear colleagues from IDB and from elsewhere, we appreciate really your presence today to seize the opportunity to share your knowledge and perspective on this matter. The webinar is about nothing else than our common desire of building credible and investment-ready regulatory frameworks in Africa energy sector, crafted through an extraordinary partnership. Mrs. Debbie said it all already regarding Africa's huge availability of natural resources, including conventional energy resources. But yet, as we have all witnessed, the continent still has difficulty to attract a significant amount of global energy investment, be it from inside or from foreign direct investment. And therefore, the reason for Africa lagging in terms of the volume of investment needed to secure universal access and continuous and sustainable access to energy resources is not, therefore, the absence of viable opportunities, but the persistence of regulatory and institutional barriers of deficiencies and correlated risks that increase uncertainty and raise the cost of capital, and therefore discouraging investors. Investors want certainty. Investors want clarity. Investors want stability and a level playing field to be able or to be willing to commit their resources and not divert them towards other uses. Therefore, credible regulation in Africa is fundamental. The level of predictability needed in the rules, the transparency in the procurement and licensing processes, the ability to have financially sustainable tariff frameworks, enforceable contracts, abidance by the rule of the contracts and the laws, capable institutions that are able of making independent and evidence-based decisions are critical factors to change the course of affairs. At the same time, regulatory framework reforms that are much needed at this time must protect the consumers, particularly the vulnerable household, and ensure that investments translate into affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy services, as I mentioned before. Africa doesn't deserve less than what has been achieved in other continents. At the Islamic Development Bank, we recognize, and we did recognize for quite some time, that financing infrastructure alone, which is one of our mainstay, is not sufficient to develop access at scale and in a sustainable manner, especially if you want to attract the private sector, again, be it local or foreign private sector. We must therefore help our member states to strengthen the institutions that regulate the sector, ensure sound sector governance, and equally important elements, ensure effective, transparent regulations, fair regulations that can allow to convert investment projects into sustainable development outcomes. Today's discussion therefore provides, again, an opportunity to learn from practical experiences, to zoom into the needed or the most needed reforms that can reduce the investment risks, strengthen cooperation among regulators, which is another important dimension. And you, people from the African School of Regulation and the forum, would help governments, utilities, and investors and development partners in building that confidence that we need to invest at scale and catch up on the needed access for all. I thank, therefore, the African School of Regulation and AFUR for their partnership. And I warmly welcome again all participants, wherever they come from. And we look forward to productive but action-oriented discussion that is useful for practical adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Idrissa Dia, for your opening remarks. We will now transition to a setting presentation that will provide the context and the key issue for today's panel discussion. To help us do so, we are honored to welcome Dr. Abdul Kadir Shetima, the Executive Director of the African School of Regulation, to deliver our setting presentation. Dear Executive Director, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Koku. Let me share my screen. Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes, Director.
Okay, thank you very much, Koku and Debbie and Mr. Dear, for the remarks made. I agree with both of you. I think you've covered half of what I'm going to say. In a nutshell, I think we're clear. We have the ambition. We know that predictable and transparent, stable regulations are required to attract investment, especially given the fact that despite Africa contributing 18% of the global population, it attracts only 3% of global energy investments. So I think we need clear policies, rule of law, of course, proper planning, sound regulation, implementation with sound monitoring and evaluation, and of course, building the capacity of institutions, to ensure that institutions and officials that are tasked to implement policies and regulations have the necessary capacity. So good morning, and it is my pleasure to join you today and also thank the African Forum for Utility Regulators. They are our strong partner in transforming Africa's energy sector. And also let me thank the Islamic Development Bank for partnering with us on this very important initiative. Africa's energy sector stands at a defining moment across the continent. Many countries have clear ambitions, from Mission 300, Energy Compacts, have clear goals from national and subnational electrification plans on electricity access, expanding electricity access, scaling up renewable energy, strengthening regional power markets. The ambitions are clear, but despite this clarity of ambition, of policy, of momentum, the fundamental issue remains what would give investors the confidence to commit long-term capital. And in a nutshell, the presentation today would focus on the fact that credible regulation is not just an oversight. It is one of the most powerful tools we have for attracting investment and delivering sustainable energy outcomes. To provide context, the scale of Africa's energy challenge is well understood. Over 600 million Africans lack access, and investment alone does not automatically deliver reliable service or financially healthy utilities or sustainable sector growth. In many cases, projects are delayed, utilities are under serious financial stress, and private investment is not materializing at the scale or pace that we need. This suggests that the challenge is not only about mobilizing more capital. It is creating the conditions that allow investments to succeed. In my view, the central message of today's presentation is that Africa is often described as having an investment gap. That is true, but I would argue that it is equally facing a regulatory gap. There is a reason why investments are far short of the required scale when compared to other regions of the world, whether South America, North America, Europe, South Asia. The Africa is lagging, and there is a reason why that is happening. It is because investors do not invest based on potential alone. They invest where the rules are clear, contracts are respected, and revenues are predictable, and the institutions inspire confidence to make the investments. One statement I think here is that capital is abundant, but bankable projects are scarce in Africa. The difference between having bankable projects and capital abundance is often regulation. Weak regulatory frameworks increases the cost of capital, as Dia mentioned. It lengthens negotiations and discourages, repeat investments. And governments across Africa have adopted, various policies. Many have set renewable energy targets, electrification goals from the Mission 300 compacts and regional market integration. But policies themselves cannot attract investment. Someone has to translate those ambitions into predictable rules, fair market arrangements, and commercially viable projects. That is where regulation comes to play. Good regulation would create, confidence that decisions will be transparent, evidence-based, and consistently applied. In short, regulation is what connects policy ambition with investment decisions. It is the cornerstone of investment confidence. One idea I would encourage us to embrace is that regulation should be viewed as a form of infrastructure itself. We often think about, infrastructure as power plants, transmission lines, and the rest, but investors also depend on institutional infrastructure, credible rules, predictable decision-making, and effective regulatory institutions. We all know, these are fundamental. Credible regulation, reduces uncertainty, and one thing investors, shy away is uncertainty. No one wants to risk his capital. That we know that, but we don't translate our, policies and regulations to reflect that fact. Now, building investment-ready regulatory frameworks. I would highlight three interconnected pillars. The first is institutional credibility. Regulators need sufficient independence to make objective decisions while remaining accountable and transparent. So it starts from the laws setting up the regulators, the appointment of the regulators. Everything should be designed in a manner that the regulators would be, as much as possible, independent, transparent, and accountable. The second is regulatory quality. Investors, as I have mentioned, and Debbie and Dia have mentioned, investors, they value predictability, consistency, and evidence-based decision-making, because these together would reduce uncertainty. And then the third is investment readiness. This is where regulation becomes practical through efficient, licensing frameworks, tariffs reflecting the revenue requirement, contracts are enforced, and dispute resolution mechanisms are clear and in place. So when these three pillars come together, they create an environment where both the public and private capital can be deployed with confidence. Now, capacity building is crucial in all of this. I have said it, Debbie has said it, and Dia has said it. We all know the need for predictable and transparent and stable regulations, but little action is taken. And part of the reason why little action is taken is that the institutions, the regulators, the ministries, and the regulatory professionals sometimes do not have the necessary expertise and independence to make the right regulations. Across Africa, we see regulators being asked to deal with increasingly complex issues from renewable energy integration, regional power markets, to utility turnaround and innovative financing mechanisms. These responsibilities require specialized skills, strong institutions, and continuous professional development. Even in advanced markets like Europe, we have the Florence School of Regulation that was set up 20 years ago to help build the capacity of regulators to make the right regulatory decisions. And that is why I must thank again the ISDB and the AFOR for partnering with us on this and other capacity building enhancements, because it is crucial. It is what will make a difference. It is what will drive institutions to invest in human capital to make the right decisions that would attract investment. So capacity building should not be viewed as an optional support activity. It is a strategic investment in the credibility and resilience of the sector itself. And this is precisely where the African School of Regulation seeks to make a contribution, working with regulators across the continent to strengthen technical capability, support institutional development, and help build regulatory frameworks that would inspire confidence and attract bankable investments. So in concluding, let me highlight three key messages. First, capital follows credible regulation. Investors are looking for predictable institutions as much as they are looking for attractive projects. And the second is financially sustainable utilities remain fundamental. Without commercially viable counterparties, without tariffs reflecting the revenue requirements, even well-designed regulatory frameworks will struggle to unlock investment. And the third is that building regulatory capacity must become a continuous process, not a series of isolated interventions. So strong institutions are built over time, not one-off. This leads us to some key questions that I hope our panelists will help us explore or decipher. One is, which regulatory reforms generate the greatest investment confidence? And second, how can regulators maintain credibility while operating in politically and financially challenging environments, as many African regulators currently face? And thirdly, what should African countries prioritize over the next few years, to build a strong investment-ready energy sector? So I look forward to hearing the perspectives of our distinguished panelists and to a rich discussion. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Executive Director, for setting the scene. We will now move to the panel discussion, and I am pleased to hand over to Dr. Ashraf, who is a senior global energy specialist with the Economic and Social Infrastructure Department at the Islamic Development Bank. Dr. Ashraf, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kuku. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, and esteemed panelists. Welcome to this in Africa's energy sector. So let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Ashraf Khaddam. I'm the Senior Global Energy Specialist at the Islamic Development Bank. And it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for today's session. As Africa seeks to attract greater investment, expand energy access, and support sustainable economic growth, strong and transparent and predictable regulatory frameworks are essential. We have an excellent panel with us today to share their perspectives and experiences on this important topic. Um, at this point, we will move on to the panel discussion. Could you please stop the presentation and invite our panelists to turn on their cameras? Just a few housekeeping items before we dive in. Please keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. Use the chat box for any questions, and we will get to them during the Q&A session. And this session is being recorded and will be shared afterward. Let me begin by briefly introducing our esteemed panelists. The first panelist, please join me in welcoming Mr. Alaji Basiru Gay, lead global energy specialist at the Islamic Development Bank. Mr. Gay has extensive experience in energy policy, regulation, and infrastructure development across Africa. He currently leads energy sector initiatives and ISDB and previously managed major infrastructure projects in Cameroon and Nigeria. Also, our next panelist is Mr. James Manda, Technical Manager at the African Forum for Utility Regulators, with more than 21 years of experience in Africa's energy sector. Mr. Manda has worked extensively in utility regulation, technical compliance, and energy project development. Then also, it's my pleasure to welcome Engineer Notifafa Kodzo, the Director of Training at the African School of Regulation, an experienced energy regulatory professional, power systems engineer, and energy economist. He brings over 17 years of expertise in electricity regulation, tariff design, regional power markets, and energy policy. So to set the stage for our discussion, let me start with a question to all panelists, starting by Mr. Alaji. In 1 minute, what would you consider the single most important ingredient of a credible and investment-ready regulatory framework?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashraf, for that question. I'll try and answer it in less than 1 minute. I think the scene has already been set by the opening remarks from Debbie, Idrissa, and the presentation from Abdul Kadir. In my view, I think the most important ingredients is to have a clear and predictable rules that are consistently and transparently enforced. So in this, I'll underline enforced, because as said by Abdul Kadir, we have most of our countries in Africa have the rules, the institutions, the frameworks. I can say that almost all the African countries have established independent regulatory authorities, but what is lacking in most cases is the transparent enforcement of those rules. Your rules are as good as when they are properly implemented. So for me, I think I'll underline implementation and enforcement, because if you have the best rules in the world without implementing them, then the impact that was intended in the design of those rules will not be would not be accomplished. So for me, I'll just say that the most important ingredient is transparent enforcement. Transparent in the sense that the investors and the utilities and the players in the market should have proper visibility in terms of what the rules of the games are. And in the event that there are disputes, they should know how to go about getting the remedies that they deserve. So just to repeat myself, I think enforcement. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Alaji, for that insightful response. Building on that point, I would like to directly directly to Mr. James.
All right, there we are. Thank you very much. And I spoke into mute, but here we are. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. So the one most important thing to start with, of course, I had 3, but I only have 1 minute. So I'll dwell on the one most important thing that I think could unlock the development or the building of the improvement of the energy infrastructure and the energy sector in Africa. That one most important thing to me would be the development of regulatory frameworks that encourage the cost-effective tariff guidelines. Now, let me just explain very briefly. Take it from a personal point of view. If you are going to invest money in a bank or in a savings scheme or in any investment scheme, think about the amount of due diligence that you do at a personal level. So much. You want to know the accounts for the previous 5 years. You want to know whether this investment scheme has been making money. You want to know whether it is stable. Now, think about that into the energy sector. How much due diligence do these investors conduct into Africa in order to invest their money, their hard-earned money? So my priority number 1 is that Africa must shy away from, we must not shy away from improving the tariff conditions at all levels. So cost-effective tariffs means that once an investor invests their money, they will be able to recoup their investment within a period of time that we have agreed upon. And that is very important, predictability. You have all spoken about predictability. You have all spoken about independent regulatory authorities. But this one issue of cost reflectivity is very important. And I think that once we are brave enough as Africa, we will reap the good things that come with the cost reflective tariffs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let me invite Engineer Notifafa to respond to the same question. What would you consider the single most important ingredient of a credible and investment-ready regulatory framework?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ashraf. I think the previous speakers have exhausted the list. So I will just try to summarize it by saying that for me, the single most important ingredient will be regulatory credibility. And though this credibility is built through consistency, must be built through consistency, where investors, utilities, and consumers must be able to understand the rules, see how decisions are made, and maybe be able to predict the decisions of the regulator and trust that those rules will be applied fairly over time. So in simple terms, the rules must be clear before the investment. The rules must be stable during the investment and enforceable when disputes arise. So the investors know that they are well covered by regulations because of the credibility of the regulator over time. Thank you, Dr. Ashraf.
Thank you all for these insightful perspectives. I particularly appreciate the emphasis on consistency, transparency, predictability, cost reflective for tariff setting. This is the foundation of investor confidence. Thank you so much. And I believe it's a timely reminder that while policy may evolve, investors need confidence that the rule of the game remain fair, clear, and dependable. Thank you for setting the stage so effectively. Let me move us to our next question, which I would like to direct to Mr. Alaji from Islamic Development Bank. Our next topic focuses on investment risk. So, Mr. Alaji, the floor is yours for about 3 minutes. Africa has abundant energy resources, yet it attracts only a modest share of global energy investment. From your experience, what are the biggest regulatory risks that discourage private investors, and how can governments address them?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. From my experience and from ISDB's perspective, in terms of our operations, we have sovereign projects and we have PPP projects. When it comes to sovereign projects, especially energy projects, we always look at the regulatory arrangements as part of that project, because projects are situated in context. It could be a regional project, it could be a national project. So if it is a domestic project, we look at the existing regulatory frameworks in that particular country, looking at the policy and the regulatory environment, the institutional arrangements, the energy sector in terms of generation, transmission, and distribution, whether that country has a vertically integrated energy sector or whether it is unbundled into the three value chains. So we look at all those aspects of the regulatory framework, and through that, we're able to identify certain risks. Basically, we have three risks that we sort of assess. We look at the policy and regulatory certainty to see whether regulatory decisions are arbitrary. Do tariffs change frequently, and what are the bases of those changes? Is it based on cost? Is it based on political pressure? Is it based on affordability concerns and all that? So we need to see that regulatory decisions are based on evidence. They're evidence-based and they're not arbitrary. I think that's one aspect we need to look at. So when we're looking at our projects, we do that assessment to sort of understand through various sources, through the discussions we have with the countries when we appraise the projects, to understand how their regulatory arrangements function. So policy and regulatory certainty is key. It has to be stable, it has to be evidence-based. The second and related factor is sector financial viability. The various studies have been done by other MTBs as well that discovered that in Africa, only a handful of countries at different periods of time, you can say up to 10 or maximum 12, are able to, for their utilities, are able to recover their cost of providing service, their operating cost and their cost of capital. And in that case, that becomes a problem for the viability of the utility. So for instance, if you have an IPP in a particular country, you need to have an off-taker, and usually the off-taker is the public utility. So if the public utility cannot recover its efficient cost of service, the IPP will not be viable. And investors always make that due diligence to ensure that before they establish that IPP, that they're able to recover their cost of providing service. So that becomes a deterrent. So weak sector financial viability is a big concern as far as risks are concerned. So basically, in our projects, we see how we can mitigate that. And that takes us to capacity building as well, because we sometimes extend capacity building support to the countries in terms of their regulatory frameworks, in terms of training. If they need a consultant, we could help to ensure that certain gaps are filled. I think Abdul Qadir mentioned in his presentation that instead of that, not only an investment gap, it becomes a regulatory gap. So I think this partnership that ISDB has with AFOR and ASR will go a long way in addressing that challenge. The last and not the least issue is weak regulatory institutions and enforcement. I think I alluded to this in my earlier intervention, that having regulatory institutions in place is not enough. That's the baseline, basically. Once you have that, you need to build on that. They need to have appropriate capacity. Sometimes it's a matter of copy and paste. Okay, countries that have done it, regions that have done it before, like basically in the Western Hemisphere, whereby they've had long years of having a tradition of independent regulation. We tend to adopt those reforms in our context. But sometimes we establish these institutions without giving them the appropriate support, without giving them the right capacity, the right resources in terms of human, financial, to be able to exist as proper regulatory authorities. So I think this is a key issue, and I think this risk should be addressed to the government, because the government is established these independent regulatory authorities. And it is always said that a regulator is as independent as its government wants it to be. So the government that establishes has to ensure that all aspects of independence and autonomy are in place for the regulator to carry out its function. So I'll give an example. Nigeria comes to mind in terms of the National Electricity Regulatory Commission. It has been established and it was given a lot of support by various governments. And most recently, there are some bright spots in terms of their mini-grids regulations, which specifically has addressed the gap in rural electrification. And through forward-looking and advanced mini-grids regulations, they were able to attract private mini-grids developers. And as a result, the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria has reported over 7 million people reached within a very short span. So basically, in conclusion, these are the three issues that are key in ensuring that these risks are mitigated to ensure that you attract the right investments, whether it is regional projects, whether it is mini grids, whether it's at the distribution segment and throughout the value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Alaji, for highlighting those important challenges. Your comments highlighted that the key challenge is not often resource availability, but rather reducing uncertainty and implementation risk. So I particularly appreciate the practical example of how governments can strengthen investor confidence and create a more enabling investment environment. Thank you so much. That brings us naturally to the question of regulatory incentives and mechanisms. So this question is directed to both Mr. James and Engineer Notifafa. But let me start with you, Mr. James. In about 3 minutes, could you share your thought on what regulatory incentives or mechanisms, for example, guarantees, tariff frameworks, or licensing regimes, are most effective in attracting long-term capital?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I think let me just highlight what the previous speaker has talked about, and then I'll come to what could be some of the issues. Now, regulatory independence. When we talk about regulatory independence, what really are we talking about? Independent from who? The government develops or forms the regulatory bodies, the regulatory authorities in a country. And having been a regulator before, you work to the best of your knowledge to come up with all the frameworks. Now, there's one bottleneck that we haven't spoken about, and that is capacity building for the same decision makers. Government representatives, very important. And we need to talk about the members of parliament, very important constituency in terms of, coming up with a framework that we can call independent. Because, believe you me, there's a lot of, it's easier for the minister in charge of energy, for example, to decide against an increase in electricity tariffs in a certain country. As far as he's concerned, he's doing the consumers in that country a favor. He is not looking outside of the horizon as far as investors are concerned. So one of the takeaways that we need to really think about is how should we extend the capacity building efforts that we talk about to extend to government functionaries, members of parliament and ministers, directors in those ministries, and so on and so forth. Because this independence that we are talking about will be fallacy if we do not reach out to the decision makers and the veto holders and the members of parliament. Very important constituency in the framework of making decisions, whether against or for. I talked about tariff frameworks, and these are very emotive issues in every country in Africa. There's no government that receives an increase in tariff, a suggestion to increase tariffs from the regulator, and they are smiling. Nothing of that sort happens because they are worried about the backlash. They are worried about what the consumers will say. They are worried about the fact that this government is not caring. So we really need to extend the knowledge sharing. We really need to extend the capacity building with all strata of decision makers. That is very, very important. Now, I want to speak about something else that is a risk that we can reduce as either regulators or stakeholders in the energy sector. You know, we need, of course, it's agreeable that we need to develop very strong institutional frameworks, all right? But there's one thing that we are not talking about, and that is the regional power pool agreements. This can be a risk, and I'll describe it. You know, each country produces power either using renewable energies, others are still using coal as we speak right now in South Africa, and it's not going away anytime soon. Others are using other means of production of power. Now, a country as a standalone is a risk factor because if there's a drought, for example, arising from climate change, the investments in those countries that depend on only one source becomes a big risk. How do we mitigate such a risk? If we encouraged the regional power pool agreements, for example, the Southern African Power Pool has intentions to join with the East African Power Pool. Once this is done, then we reduce the risk of one source, single source means of power production. If it's, for example, in Zambia, before 3 years ago, most of the power was being produced from hydro. Now, we know how risky that can be. Now, if Zambia is connected to the Southern African Power Pool, and in return, the Southern Power Pool is connected to the East African Power Pool, these cross-border, cross-country interconnections are very important, and they reduce the risk of depending on one source of energy. So I want us to begin to think about encouraging frameworks, regulatory frameworks, institutional infrastructure, institutional architecture that encourages, first of all, cross borders and also across power pools so that we strengthen our networks. Because as you know, the previous speaker said that there are only a handful of countries whose books are in black, which means that most of the countries are in the red as far as the balance sheet is concerned. Now, that is a risk on its own. But if we interconnect and we begin to produce power using different means across the regions, then we would have reduced that factor, which is considered as a risk depending on one source of energy. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. James, for those valuable insights. Let me now turn to Engineer Notifafa to bring in another perspective of this issue. Let me repeat the question again. What regulatory incentives or mechanisms are most effective in attracting long-term capital? Over to you, Engineer Notifafa.
Thank you, Ashraf. And in Dr. Shetima's presentation, that's the Executive Director of the African School of Regulation, he indicated that Africa attracts only 3% of global investments. And the reason is why? It's just because we don't have the incentives. And as I said earlier, there's no consistencies in our regulation as well. So what incentives can we put in place to attract these investments? And in my view, we don't have a single incentive is not sufficient. We have a package of them. So what's the package? The package should include first, predictable tariff and revenue frameworks. Every investor wants to recoup his investments. So how will they be able to recoup this investment? There must be a credible system that they know that when they put their money into this investment, they can recover. And when we look at the power sector, we realize that most of the investments are long-term. They are long-term, so the only investment we can attract are patient capital, which sometimes take over 20 to 30 years. If our systems are not credible, our tariffs are not predictable, or revenue frameworks are not in place and consistent over a long time, no private investor will be willing to invest on our continent. The second point is, do we have a clear and bankable licensing or concession regimes? In this case, we must define the rights of the investor, their obligation, the renewal conditions, and in case of mini grids, when the grids arrives, how is that investment handled? So the investor needs this kind of assurance. We also the third point is we look at targeted payment security and guarantees. Are our guarantees credible? And how are our guarantees used? Guarantees are most valuable when they address a clearly identified risk, which could be non-payment by the off-taker. But in most cases, we try to use our guarantees to support fundamental flaws in our systems, which is like non-cost reflective tariffs or revenue requirements. So with time, we accumulate a lot of debts, which the investor is not willing, though there is guarantee, but before we fall on those guarantees, the investor might have accumulated a lot of debts, and they are not willing to invest in such countries or business ventures. The reason being that though guarantees are there, you may not be able to attract the investors because they know your system is not really credible to ensure that their revenue streams are protected. Another one is transparent procurement and standard bankable contracts. We all know that competitive procurement is the best way to go for lower cost and the rest. But when the tender documents, evaluation criteria, and the contract terms are not clear, we may have this competitive procurement, but it may not give us the result that we want. Another incentive we could send to the investors is to have performance-based incentives. It is not the case that the investor put in the money, he must recover at all costs. The regulator must ensure that at least they provide a certain standard of service so that the consumer is also protected. The regulator is to balance the interest of the consumer, the utilities, and the investors. All these people are key. So the right incentive must go to the consumers, it must go to the utilities, it must go to the investors as well. So when the regulator is able to package all these incentives and ensure credibility and consistency over time, I think it's not the fact that capital is lacking. The capital is there, but how to attract them is the problem. And when the regulator is able to put in place the right incentives, I think Africa can be able to unlock this capital. Thank you, Dr. Ashraf.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, James and Tifafa. That was...
I add just one more point.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. development of these projects is a lot of money that is required, okay? And some of these projects are huge. Now, I've got two issues, and I would like to share with you the public-private partnerships. In Zambia, a lot of projects, huge projects costing billions of dollars, have been accomplished because of the public-private partnerships, which means that the risks that are there, so the incentive is the risks that are there are shared between the public and the private, other than the private sector shouldering all the risks. So that could be an incentive. And depending on how you structure the PPP, it could attract investment into developing huge power infrastructure. The other issue is it used to be a thing previously, and we used to talk about it a lot. I don't hear about it so much now. But there was a thing called feed-in tariffs, which is a guaranteed tariff from green energy sources that sets a guaranteed tariff arising from the renewable energy sources for a period of time. So for a period of time, say 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, the investor has been incentivized for a guaranteed offtake price that can make him profitable. So I thought that these two issues should not be overlooked. The feed-in tariffs, but as well as the public-private partnership schemes, well developed, that can, you share the risks, but also you have, you also share the contribution towards the development of a certain facility. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This really useful overview of the tools available to policymakers and regulators. So what stands out is that attracting long-term capital is not necessarily about offering more incentives, but about creating credible and bankable frameworks that investors can trust over the life of their investments. So I appreciate your responses. Thank you so much. Let me come to you again, Engineer Notifafa. We have discussed the importance of sound regulatory frameworks throughout the session. However, their effectiveness ultimately depends on the strength of the institutions that implement them. From your perspective, what capacities should African regulators prioritize to become more effective and investment ready? So the floor is yours in 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ashraf. When we started this webinar, I think from the beginning, the previous speakers all mentioned capacity building. And how is this important to the regulatory function? Capacity building is very key. I always say the regulator does not own any power plants. The regulator does not directly get involved with the operation of these systems, but the regulator must have the knowledge about the system. And when you look at the core mandate of the regulator, I said initially that the regulator must balance interests, the utilities, the investors, and the consumers. How can the regulator do this? He must have the right capacity. Because if the regulator fails to build his capacity in these areas, what will happen is what we call regulatory capture, where the regulator begins to side with the utilities or other political actors or serve the interest of other stakeholders, just because he lacks the capacity. And I have been in so many forums that the regulator tends to align with the utilities because the thing becomes so technical that the regulator doesn't understand. So in order not to be embarrassed, he decides to nod to everything the utility says against the consumers. So what are the areas that the regulator has to build capacity in? In building this capacity, we have to know the core mandate of the regulator. The regulator's mandate is to set cost recovery tariffs. So first, the regulator must and also ensure the viability of the utilities, and also ensure that tariffs are affordable. So the regulator is looking at what? Economic and financial capacity. That's very key, because through economic and financial capacity is able to determine the right tariffs that the utilities require to be sustainable, and also how to ensure that tariffs are affordable for the consumers. The regulator must also bear in mind that though tariffs and other things related to the finances are key, he's regulating a system which obeys certain physical laws, which is a power system. So the regulator must also build capacity in this area, because he has to license the plants that come online. So the regulator must ensure that he has enough capacity in these areas. Otherwise, what happens sometimes is during complaint resolutions, when consumers make complaint, the regulator is not able to investigate well, because first, the regulator himself lacks the capacity. I remember working in a regulatory institution. That's when consumers complain about the inefficiencies of the regulators. Let me take, for example, metering inaccuracy. We still relied on the utilities equipment to test whether the meters are reading accurately. And the utility engineers are the ones who actually connect their metering devices to test this accuracy. How sure are we on the result? We don't even understand them. They have to write the report and said, oh, the meters are within the accuracy limit. But with time, we procured our own metering equipment, metering test equipment, and we're able to challenge them on some of these things. So though the regulator does not have this plant and the rest, he has to ensure that he has capacity in this thing. Now, and also, the regulator must set standards, engineering standards. How does the regulator set engineering standards if he doesn't know much about the system? And how do we enforce these standards? In enforcing these standards and enforcing compliance with these standards, we need the legal aspect. So the regulator must also build capacity in legal licensing and tariff enforcement. Regulator does not have any machines, but he must ensure that he sees everything that happens on the system. So that means the regulator must collect data. So data and digital capacity is very important to the regulator as well, because with that, he's able to see everything that is happening just by sitting in his office. And also, we have consumers. Consumers, we must balance their interests. Consumers are part of the stakeholders. We must be able to engage them. So we have emerging markets as well, emerging technologies. The regulator must always be ahead of the institutions, of the utilities. So how does it do it? The regulator must always build capacity of its staff to ensure that they are not captured by the utilities they regulate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Notifafa, for those valuable insights. Your remarks remind us that regulations are only as effective as the institutions that implement them. So building technical expertise, regulatory independence, and implementation capacity appears to be just as important as designing the right policies in the first place. So thank you for highlighting that. Let me shift our attention to another critical issue, leveraging regulation to unlock investment. And I would like to hear from all our distinguished panelists on this topic, beginning with Mr. Alaji. From your perspective, working in multilateral development bank, how can regulatory frameworks specifically reduce perceived and real investment risks for private sector participation, particularly in independent power producers, mini grids, off-grids providers? So the floor is yours in 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ashraf, for that question. When it comes to risks, in terms of Africa, most of the issue has to do with perceived risks. There are some studies that have been done, some analysis that have been done that have shown that most of the risks that are associated with the continent are perceived. And this is as a result of opaque and non-transparent rules of the game, as I said, regulations, basically. And this can only be mitigated if investors can understand the rules to enable them to calculate returns and observe consistent regulatory decisions. So apart from having the rules in place, they should be very transparent. Also, there's the real risks are there as well. But as I mentioned, compared to many regions of the world, default rates when it comes to investments in Africa are not as high as they're perceived to be. So those real risks as well can be mitigated when the rules that have been established are enforced and the regulators are fully funded. They have the autonomy to make the right decisions. So I'll look at several points, several issues in terms of how regulatory frameworks can reduce the perception of risks. The first one is licensing and permitting procedures. I'll give you an example. When I used to work in the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority in the Gambia, the Regulatory Act divided the regulatory functions between the so-called independent regulatory authority and the Minister of Energy. Okay, in some aspects like tariff setting, the regulator has complete autonomy. But when it came to licensing, the regulator only could receive the application, do the technical due diligence, and make a recommendation to the minister who has the authority to grant the license. And that was a big problem because for any investor looking at that framework, will see that this regulator is not as independent as it should be. And if regulatory decisions are politicized, that becomes a very big risk and becomes a deterrent for investors to get in. I understand that recently there are efforts to amend the Regulatory Act to address that key provision to ensure that the regulator is independent and has the right autonomy to make the right decisions. The other issue has to do with ensuring that project revenues are predictable and bankable. And regulation should ensure that for both IPPs, mini-grid developers, and other service providers. So for IPPs, there is need to have standard power purchase agreements because for some of us that have been involved in negotiating power purchase agreements, it's a very tedious process. So it's very cumbersome and time consuming. So I think the regulatory framework should be forward-looking. It should have standardized power purchase agreements, templates that would guide investors so that even before the investor goes into the country, maybe from the website of the regulator, you'll see those templates, those guidelines in terms of guiding you in how these power purchase agreements would be discussed, agreed, and signed. So that shortens the process and ensures that it facilitates the investments. Another point, I think this was raised by James in terms of regional projects. He was looking at the regional architecture, whereby we have different power pools in Africa. I think we have 5, East African power pool, East African power pool, West African, Central African power pool, South African power pool, and in North Africa, I think North Africa has a power pool as well. So those institutions are trying to create regional markets, given the fact that we have abundant energy resources in Africa, and these markets ensures that these resources are harnessed and market rules are in place to ensure that countries that have surplus capacity in certain resources, it could be renewable, it could be conventional energy, can be exported across borders. But this requires rules. Rules have to be in place to ensure that this happens, and it happens seamlessly. In terms of that arrangement, it requires regional regulatory frameworks as well. So you need another layer of regulation. In addition to the national regulatory authorities, which are responsible for their own jurisdictions, you need a cross-border regulatory authority that covers a broader jurisdiction. Like, let's say, for instance, in West Africa, we have the ECOWAS Regional Electricity Regulatory Authority, which is responsible for regulating the regional market in West Africa. So it has to set in place the market rules in terms of licensing, in terms of ensuring that transmission charges are set based on cost and all that. So those are very important in terms of the regulatory architecture. So now here we're introducing more complexity. That in addition to national rules, we need to have supranational rules, cross-border rules to facilitate supply of electricity across borders. And also the regulatory framework should provide a signal, should provide an incentive for an investor to locate its power plant in any of the member countries. I'm giving West Africa as an example. I'm more familiar with that region because I had experience working with the regional regulator in that part of Africa. So you can set up a power plant in Benin or Nigeria, and because you have the rules, you have confidence that the rules are very robust. They were set based on evidence, and you can set up your power plant and have like a corporate PPA, for instance, maybe let's say a factory in Benin might require your power, and probably the national utility in Benin, the sector in Benin cannot provide the power it requires. So that IPP in Nigeria can supply power to that factory in Benin, but the power has to be transmitted through cross-border lines, and these are based on clear rules. That there should be transmission service charges should be clear, the PPAs should be very clear, and the regional regulator will sort of will sort of supervise that arrangement to ensure that the demand and supply across countries are met. So that's another factor. Also, we have a foreign exchange risk as well. In terms of, let's say, in terms of financing, from the perspective of a development bank, most of our lending is in foreign currency, and the revenues in the sector is generated in national currencies, and in some countries, because of macroeconomic instability, some currencies are not stable. So the issue becomes, how would the utility recover cost in local currency that's not stable and repay the debt in foreign currency? So that's why PPAs should have the right indexation to ensure that a certain local currency risks are mitigated. And we should also look at, as MDBs, local currency financing as well, to sort of mitigate that risk. I think that's a big risk for investments in some countries. Lastly, I'll end there with mini-grids and off-grid solutions. IEA has established that most of the access gap that are going to be met up to 2020, either through the SDGs or through Mission 300, which is more recent, will be met through off-grid and mini-grid solutions. I think the magnitude is about 50-something%, given that most of the access gap is in rural communities. So in that case, the rules have to be simplified, if you want, because we're talking about 4 years to 2030, to accelerate implementation, the pace of reforms and all those things. The rules have to be simplified. They have to be transparent, so that it makes it easier for developers to invest in these countries. As for instance, when it comes to tariffs, you can have multi-year tariffs. Instead of calculating tariffs every year, it could be very cumbersome for a developer. They're not big utilities, they're not big investors, so if you have multi-year tariffs, it makes it easier for them to be able to invest and forecast their revenues and make the analysis so that they can plan ahead. So that's key. So the reason why I'm ending with mini grids, because as I mentioned, we expect that we'll see most of the investments in that space, given that most of the access gap is concentrated in the rural communities. I'll stop there. Thank you,
Mr. Alaji. You have highlighted several important risk mitigation measures. Thank you. I just would like to invite all panelists to be short, because we are running out of time, just to limit your intervention in 3 minutes or less than, so we can accommodate a couple of questions. Let me bring the rest of the panel. Engineer Notifafa, from your perspective, which regulatory interventions are most effective in reducing risk and improving investor confidence? So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ashraf. And just based on, I think Dr. Alaji has exhausted all the points under this question, so I'll be brief. And just to continue with what I said on the capacity building, to allocate the first step in reducing risk, the first step the regulator is to take, in my view, is to allocate the risks to the party that can best manage it. You know, in this case, you don't assign risks to someone you know definitely cannot manage the risk. There will be default. Let's say in a course we've been teaching in private investment in transmission, we have seen in some regulations where they allocate the risks of losses, the losses to the private investor. So the question is, the private investor is just owning one line. How does he manage the losses on that particular line? And also, you have to know how is losses calculated. We normally use average losses, not for just a single line. So the regulator must be technically equipped. That's the case. And the first step, as I said, is to allocate the risk in the sector to the party that can best manage it. So, and there must also be incentives, certain incentives in place. Let's take, for instance, for the IPPs, the curtailment rules. Are they incentive compatible? Incentive compatible means when I obey you, the instructions of the system operator, does it mean I've lost revenue? If it means I will lose revenue, then I will not listen to the system operator. And I have been in meetings where the system operator of Ghana has complained to the technical regulator, Energy Commission, that certain generators don't back down when they ask them to go offline. Why do they do that? Because their revenue will be affected. What has the regulator put in place to mitigate that? If there is nothing in place, the instructions are not incentive compatible, you see that the utilities will always ignore the system operator. And when we get to mini grids, grid arrival, when it comes, when the grid finally arrives at the community where the mini grids are, what rules are in place? Those risks the regulator must take steps to ensure that those risks do not come to light. And also solar home systems, the product quality. So the regulator in a it's particularly because the regulator must understand the product is regulated. And in trying to mitigate the risk, the regulator must ensure that it does not create excessive cost or open-ended liabilities for consumers or the government. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a valuable perspective on risk reduction. Thank you so much. Mr. James, would you agree or do you see other regulatory mechanisms that are equally important for attracting private capital? Yes, go ahead.
Very important. The interventions that have been provided by my two colleagues are very important, and I agree with them. But at the risk of repeating ourselves, let me just make this very clear. You know, we mentioned the PPAs, the development of PPAs, but let these PPAs be long-term, okay? We clearly reduce the risk by introducing long-term PPAs. I know of a country that has got generating licenses of up to 30 years. Pricing, very important. I think it's worth repeating that the cost recovery is very important as far as pricing is concerned. But also, my colleague mentioned the one important small factor, but very important. Remember that most of our African countries have got volatility in their local currencies. And if we want to make this, to reduce the risks associated with the local currencies, we need to put that inflation adjustment in pricing, okay? On a yearly basis, on a 2-year basis, and so on and so forth. So inflation adjustments are very important to maintain the level of stability that you agreed upon at the beginning of that contract. Lastly, but not at all minimizing this issue, it has already been mentioned, clear licensing and rules. These are very important. But I want to add fast approvals. When you license a facility, let it be done in a period that is acceptable so that the investor in the intervening time does not lose his resources. So licensing, very good. The development of rules, very important, but fast approvals. Do not delay licensing for unnecessarily long periods of time, thereby reducing the viability of that project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Really, this is very important comments, which underscore that reducing both perceived and actual risks is critical if we want to unlock larger volume of private capital for independent power producers, for mini grids, for other innovative energy solutions. Thank you for that. And let me now turn to a forward-looking issue that is becoming increasingly important across Africa's energy landscape. And I will come to you again, Mr. James, in 2 minutes. As technologies such as distributed renewable energy, mini grids, battery storage, and electric mobility continue to evolve and reshape the energy landscape, how should how should the regulatory frameworks adapt to these emerging technologies without creating unnecessary uncertainty for investors? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I was privileged to attend the Euro Solar Power Conference in Berlin, in Munich, in Germany. And the issue of battery storage is on top of the agenda. Look, if we want to put up isolated systems, renewable energy, solar systems, if you are going to displace a certain amount of power from the national grid during the day, what it means is that you cannot just make that disappear during the night. You are going to cause serious power instability. So the issue of battery storage, therefore, comes in very important and handy. And the regulators must be knowledgeable enough to sanction and allow developers to put in battery storage into the system. Not just battery storage, I think there's also an issue of these ancillary services, black start capabilities, synchronous condensation, and so on and so forth. Regulators, we talked about the issue about skills training. Regulators must be skilled enough to understand. If they're going to sanction these things, they must be the first ones to understand what these systems do into a power network. And once you do that, then issues such as battery storage will be very important. Issues such as the black start capabilities will be very important, and so on and so forth. So I urge regulators to seek top-level, capacity building from, African School of Regulation. We also do the African Forum for Utility Regulation. We can help for regulators to understand and, improve their capabilities in order for them to allow the systems to work properly. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for that forward-looking perspective. Your comments highlight a critical challenge for regulators today, how to support innovation and technological change while ensuring a stable and predictable investment environment. Thank you for that. And now, Engineer Notifafa, let me turn to another foundational issue for effective regulation and investment decision making. In 2 minutes or 1.5 minute, what strategies can regulators adopt to improve data availability, quality, and management systems within the energy sector?
Okay, and I'll try to be short, as you've indicated. Data is very key to the regulator because that's the only information he has about the utilities. So data is very key. So what strategies should the regulator adopt to obtain data? First, they must establish a minimum regulatory data set. what information do they need? So they must specify all this and ensure that the utilities are able to provide them. You don't give a data set you know the utilities cannot provide or are not relevant for your work. Yes, sometimes we are tempted to collect so much data from the utilities, though we know we'll not use them. So we end up putting extra burden on the utilities. And we must also adopt common definitions and data dictionary. If we are talking about voltage, what type of voltage? What voltage level are we talking about? So we don't just send a request to the utilities, provide us voltage data. No, we must be specific. And the template must be standardized. If Ghana has three distribution utilities, the template must be the same for all three utilities so that we can easily compare their performance. And we must also automate validation and exception checks, because doing it manually sometimes introduce errors. And in my regulatory institutions, we collected data from the utilities, and it comes to the regulatory department and the engineering department. We enter this data during our annual reporting. We all use the same data, but our graphs are different. Our outcomes are different. Why? Because there were errors in the manual computations. So when we automate these things, it helps. And we must also encourage periodic independent verification. Independent verification could be through audits, and also sometimes internally during our monitoring activities. But in to collect more data. It is not the more data you collect from the utility that means you are working. No, it's collect data that will help us in our decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Engineer Tifafa. I appreciate your emphasis on strengthening data system as a strategic priority for the sector. Thank you so much, and really this is a very rich and very exciting session. So many information. Now we are coming to the last question. Thank you, and let me conclude with one final question, and I would invite each panelist to keep the response concise so we can hear from the audience their feedback. So in 1 minute, if you could recommend only one action for African governments and regulators to make their energy sectors more efficient, more investment ready, what it would be. So I will start by Mr. James.
That is a very important question. One of the most important issues is that previously, so many years before, countries have been working in isolation. Each country ensured that their energy plans are concerning that country only. But in the new dispensation, we really need to encourage cross-border, cross-country development of energy infrastructure. So, for example, if one country is lacking in generation, you can develop a combined generating facility, either at the border or wherever is feasible, as 2 countries or 3 countries. That way, you manage to put together the synergies from the two or three different countries that are available. So my plea is, going forward, let countries be encouraged to develop the power sector jointly with other countries in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Notifafa. If you could recommend only one action for African governments and regulators to make their energy sectors more efficient, more investment ready.
Yes, if I'm to recommend, I would recommend consistency in implementation. Many African countries already have sound laws, they have the tariff methodologies, and they have the investment plans. The gap is often between the written framework and the actual decisions. So in my view, when rules are implemented consistently, the risk premium falls, the capital becomes more patient, and consumers gain stronger grounds to demand better service. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alaji. Go ahead.
I think I agree with Engineer Tifafa. I don't have much to add to that. I think I've mentioned the point before that you can have all the rules and the frameworks, but if you don't implement them, if you don't enforce them, they are good as nothing. So I think for me, I think what's important is the governments and regulators should commit to transparently enforcing, tariff rules, licensing, contractual commitments, and all those things. I think that's what makes a regulatory framework credible. If you don't enforce them, it doesn't mean anything. And in Africa, since we're talking Africa is the subject, we have all the rules, if you go to any country, they have all the laws, the regulations, the policies in place. But the gap is always enforcement and implementation. So for me, I think that's where we should concentrate on. Thank you.
Thank you all for those concise and powerful recommendations. Collectively, your perspectives highlighted that building investment-ready energy sector is not just about having the right policies, but also about ensuring consistency in implementation, in institutional capacity, and long-term commitment. So thank you so much for that, and to all our panelists for a rich and insightful discussion. Your perspectives have highlighted both the opportunities and the practical actions needed to strengthen regulatory frameworks and unlock greater investments in Africa, in Africa's energy sector. Thank you so much. And now we will move to the Q&A session. And I see we are the time is running very fast, so we would be delighted to receive your questions from the audience. So please feel free to raise your hand. We also receive several questions through the chat box, and we will address some of those as well. So kindly introduce yourself and your organization before asking the question. I can see there is a very detailed question, very excellent one from Zainab. Zainab Gatti, if you could.
Yes, Dr. Ashraf, please. Before that, there's Prof. Ignacio that raised up. Maybe would like to say something.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Koku and moderator and panelists. Congratulations for the excellent insights, and that has been a great webinar. And well, I'd like to make a couple of comments. My name is Ignacio Perez Arriaga. I was the former interim director of the African School of Regulation, and now I am a senior advisor to the school. And well, the first comment is the following. I agree that the regulation has to be stable, has to be predictable, the regulators must be independent. But what happens if the regulation is wrong? So could be stable but wrong, could be predictable but wrong, could be the regulator could be very independent, but the regulation is wrong. And we have multiple examples of that. My colleague Nutifafa has indicated, for instance, one. If the remuneration of transmission depends on the losses in the transmission line, we regulators are creating a risk that is unnecessary. If the remuneration of transmission depends on the flows in the lines, if we want to build a new line and we want private investment to come, and we say that, well, the money that we are going to pay you depends on the flows, then they will not invest. And we see that in Africa. There is no private investment in transmission in Africa. So I think that there is one additional level to what some things that we have been saying today, which is that we have to make sure that the regulation is correct. Because, for instance, the regulation for what happens with distributed energy resources in most countries is inadequate, and it is creating transfers of money from people who do not have solar panels in the rooftops to people who have. And that, in the end, will stop the investment of people in the rooftops and the collapse of the solar companies, as has happened in other parts of the world. If we leave the mini grids to to the market, even if we have regulation that determines the tariffs, and even if we have regulations saying what happens when the grid arrives, if we don't fix the problem at the heart of the mini grids, which is that mini grids are not financially viable except for a few, we need to provide some permanent subsidies to the mini grids. Because if we want to make the tariffs, the end consumer tariffs, affordable, and at the same time to make investors to build mini grids, this is incompatible. We need a subsidy in the middle. So I think that we have to go one level below at the technical design of the regulation and make sure that that technical design is incentive compatible, as Nutifafa was saying, and I think that we all agree. But I think that that additional level is important. The second point is that I think that regulators should be proactive in reducing the credit risk. It has been mentioned today many times that there is a problem of affordability in rural areas. That, by the way, I want on my grave to be written the sentence, cost-reflective tariffs do not exist, so that people who pass by my grave will see that sentence written and might remember. What has to be cost-reflective is the revenue requirement. I think this is what was meant all the time. The tariffs, the end consumer tariffs, are never cost-reflective. People pay more than they should or pay less than they should. What is important is that globally, the tariffs globally pay the revenue requirement. But we know that that doesn't happen in most of sub-Saharan African countries, if not all. So if we want to have private investment in a situation in which the money collected does not pay the total cost, what could the regulators do? Well, we are advising the South African government in trying to raise $15 billion in private investment in transmission. Some of my colleagues are involved in that with me. And then ESCOM, we know that is in a dire financial situation. So what can we do to make sure that those people that South Africa want to invest a large amount of money in transmission, how is that possible if the money is not collected? Well, this is something that has been invented in several countries around the world and also in Africa, for instance, in Ghana. Putting all the money that is collected in a bag and giving priority to the projects that you want to minimize the credit risk. So if you say that those few lines that are a percentage of the total cost of transmission, that is 10% of the total cost of electricity, then it's a minor fraction of the total amount that should be recovered, and for sure has been recovered from the tariffs. So if the regulator set the priority that those investments that we want the private sector to do are shielded, are ring-fenced, because we provide a waterfall or a priority in recovering the cost, then we are helping enormously private investment in transmission, in generation, in whatever, in distribution, etc. So these are my two comments, but I repeat the congratulations for an excellent webinar, and I have enjoyed listening to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Ignacio, for this excellent intervention. Thank you so much. And as we are running out of the time, I will suggest having one question from the audience. And I can see there is one question from Zainab Dati. If you could provide your question in 30 seconds, if you can provide your question. Mrs. Zainab?
Maybe I could read. The question is in the Q&A session. Zainab is saying that I will be interested in Mr. Gay's perspectives from a DFEI perspective and Mr. James Kanda regulatory side. I think this was the question she wrote. I don't know if she's still there or he's still there.
All right. From the regulatory perspective, I've read the question, and let me just quickly provide what I think could have happened from a regulatory point of view. When an investment like that takes place and it's a PPP, I think you agree on the terms. And going forward, you want to hold what we call public hearings, okay? Where you invite the developer, but you also invite big consumers as well as small consumers to provide their input into the process of coming up with the, the final matters concerning the development of that project. The developer is invited so that they can justify why the tariff should be X and why it will take so much time before completion and so on and so forth. And then the big consumers and whoever will be the off-taker are also present. In the presence of the regulator, you agree. And once you agree, I think that you stand a bigger chance of the success of the project. If you don't hold these essential elements, such as public hearings, to a process such as the development of this big project, the failure rate could be very high from the regulatory point of view. So that is my perspective on that point. Very quickly going to I think there's a question on the feed-in tariffs and how these are implemented. So feed-in tariffs are just it's a guaranteed tariff provided to a developer of green energy being renewable energy resources, for a period of time to guarantee success of that project. And then conditions can change after a while. So those tariffs are not forever. They just provide as a starting point to give the investor surety that you'll be able to recoup his investment within that period of time. Okay. And the other questions, but let me allow other colleagues to say their minds. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may attempt to respond to the question from Zainab in terms of the issue that she presented, the PPP, which was competitively tendered, and there are only 3 offers and awarded. And basically, it's what it seems is like the government or the sponsor sort of reneged on what was agreed, what was part of the terms of the tender. So I think it's an issue of a lack of commitment, from a regulatory perspective or from a government perspective. If the rules are clear, if there are safeguards in the regulatory, you have different levels of regulatory frameworks. You have the primary law and you have regulations which are very clear. If you're doing a subsidy, if you're doing a competitive tender, I think in Africa, South Africa has the most experience in terms of auctions for renewable energy. And there has to be a legal framework. There has to be some rules, that are there. But for you to, after the fact, after the tender, renege on those rules, that says a lot about the credibility of the regulatory framework. So I think from an MDB perspective, from DFI, if the financing is from MDB or DFI, I think it's a matter of ensuring that you have the right framework, which really specifically sets the rules, which is binding on the government, that you have to stick to. If whatever you're promising, it has to be based on your frameworks, your legal frameworks, and you have to stick to it. And there should be also a provision for dispute resolution in the event that the investor or the developer is aggrieved or has an issue. There should be a mechanism for addressing their specific issues as far as that transaction is concerned. I think that's my contribution to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Alaji, and thank you, Mr. James. And I would like to hand the floor to Dr. Koko for closing session. Thank you so much, the audience and panelists, for your active participation. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Ashraf. And also thank to the panelists. We are approaching the end of the session, though we are running over the time. I would like Dr. Charlie to provide a kind of takeaway in 2 or 3 minutes before we receive our speakers for the closing remark. Dr. Charlie.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Amega. Thanks also to our distinguished panelists, our moderator, and participants for the insightful discussion. Before we conclude, let me start with a simple reflection. When an investor looks at an energy project, he's not only asking if the project is technically viable. He's also asking, can I trust the rule of the game? And will those rules still be clear tomorrow? This question goes to the heart of today's discussion. And the webinar emphasized that credible and investment-ready regulatory frameworks are essential to mobilize long-term private capital for African energy sector. Our distinguished panelists highlighted that investors are not only concerned about market opportunities, but also about the predictability, the transparency, and enforceability of the regulatory environment in which they operate. At central takeaway was the central takeaway was that the biggest regulatory risk discouraged private investment included tariff uncertainty, lack of very good tariff guideline, and delay on cost recovery, but also weak enforcement mechanisms in clear licensing procedure or risk payment. Government and regulator can address those risks by establishing clear legal mandates, transparent tariff setting methodology and attractive tariff regime, credible dispute resolution mechanisms and backup contractual frameworks, but also a consistent regulatory decision making, as well as developing capacities, technical and regulatory capacity of regulators. The discussion also underscored the importance of targeting regulatory incentive and risk mitigation mechanisms. Well-designed and attractive tariff frameworks that ensure investment recovery, standardized power purchase agreement, and streamlined licensing regime are also can significantly improve investor confidence. However, such has been designed to protect both investor and consumer. While discussion further noticed that African regulators need to prioritize capacity development in several core areas. That's what my colleague Mr. mentioned on difference like tariff design, financial and economic analysis, investment appraisal, and so on. The webinar also highlighted that regulatory framework must address both perceived and real investment risk across different market segments, including IPPs, mini-grid, and off-grid providers. This required clear rules and licensing regime, grid arrival, cost tariff approval, compensation, interconnection, and market entry as well. For private investor, clarity and predictability are often an important and as incentives. Finally, the discussion during this webinar stressed that data also is a fundamental key to credible regulation. Overall, the webinar concludes that investment-ready regulator is not achieving through isolated reform, but through a coherent institutional framework aiming to address 5C that the investor needs. What are the 5C? First, clarity. Second, certainty. Third, confidence and credibility. Fourth, consistency. And lastly, to be covered by smooth dispute resolution. But before even addressing those 5C, it is first necessary to put in place appropriate and smooth regulation that address really the investment concern regarding the attractivity of the sector, which is the appropriate one. And those regulations that should not create additional risk. So in which the regulator can reduce investment risks, unlock private sector participation, and support the development of affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy sector for our country. Thank you for your attention. That's all from my side. And over to you, Dr. Amiga.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Charlie. We now move on to the closing remark from the Executive Director of African School of Regulation and from Hussein, which is from the ESDB. So, Dr. Shetima, the floor is over to you for your closing remark.
Thank you very much, Koku. Let me thank all our panelists, the ISDB and our partners, the AFO, for this very well engaging webinar. I call on all of us to continue the dialogue, building a resilient electricity sector for Africa, as we have discussed and agreed today, requires sustained capacity building. Institutions must be capable of delivering the right investment frameworks that would attract investment. So I would like to once again thank everyone, all our participants, and all our panelists, and we look forward on these topics.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Shetima, the Executive Director of African School of Regulation. I now hand over to Mr. Hussein from the ISDB, who is the Director of the Economic Infrastructure Division, for his closing remark. Over to you, Mr. Hussein.
Thank you, Dr. Koko. Thank you, colleagues. I would like to express my high appreciation also to the African School of Regulations and African Forum for Utility Regulations for the partnership in co-organizing this important event. And also I would like to thank all the participants. I have seen and observed a very good participation from in this webinar, which reflects the importance of the topic and the willingness of the participants to know more about this important topics. I think the discussion has highlighted various important topics related to the regulations in the sector, including data, including capacity building, and overall the bottom line is how to formulate the proper regulations to attract the private investment. So I think from this discussion we could formulate and we could have some takeaway that has been summarized by Dr. Charlie, and having even listening and again from the record of this session will help a lot the participants and formulate the proper outcome of this session. The challenge now is to move from dialogue to actions, and by identifying practical reforms, practical institutional capacity building, and adopting proper regulatory frameworks to move ahead on this. From ISDB side, we still committed to working with all member countries and partners, including the ASR and AFUR, to strengthen the regulations from member countries. And once again, I would like to thank all of you, and we're looking forward to have future webinars and future cooperation occasions to deliver on this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hussein, for your insightful closing remark. We are at the end of this webinar. We would like to thank everyone on behalf of African School of Regulation, our colleagues from ISDB, from AFU, and the distinguished participants. Thank you so much for your patience. We go beyond the time we set. So this is a kind of a webinar that should engage us on the ground to more contribute to the development of African energy sector. So thank you, everyone. We are at the end of the webinar. Zita, the floor is over to you. If there is any announce that you can make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Koku. Thank you, everyone, panelists, speakers. Just to note that the ASR has a series of courses we have ongoing. I mean, one key thing we've all spoken about today has been on capacity building. So we do have 2 courses upcoming. We have one on electricity tariff, principles, methodologies, and regulatory practice. And we have another one on wholesale electricity markets in African countries. These are 1-week trainings. One will be done in Accra, Ghana, and the other will be done in Cotonou, Benin. So we'll be sending out the links to everyone, as well as posting it in the chat. So if you're interested, you could reach out to us by email. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.